Lieutenant Sarah Chun walked into the Pentagon briefing room with her head held high, despite knowing what awaited her. The massive oak table was surrounded by generals, colonels, and defense officials whose combined years of service could span several lifetimes. Their eyes tracked her movement as she took her assigned seat at the far end of the table, the spot reserved for junior officers who were expected to observe rather than contribute. At 28, Sarah was the youngest person in the room by at least 15 years. Her slight frame and youthful appearance made her look even younger, something that had worked against her throughout her military career. She had graduated top of her class from West Point, earned advanced degrees in international relations and strategic intelligence, and spent 3 years working in classified operations that she couldn't even mention to her family. Yet none of that seemed to matter when she walked into rooms like this. General Morrison, a decorated veteran with silver hair and permanent scowl lines, was reviewing the agenda when his eyes landed on Sarah. He paused mid-sentence, his expression shifting to barely concealed irritation. The room fell silent as he addressed her directly. "Lieutenant Shun, I wasn't aware we were bringing students to strategic planning meetings now." His words carried the weight of decades of command, and several officers around the table chuckled quietly. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable observing from the gallery?" Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, I was specifically requested to attend by Defense Intelligence. I have relevant expertise in the region we'll be discussing." Colonel Barnes, sitting 3 seats away, leaned back in his chair with an amused expression. "Expertise? What kind of expertise could someone your age possibly have? Did you write a college paper on the Middle East?" More laughter rippled around the table. Sarah noticed that not everyone was joining in, but those who remained silent weren't speaking up for her either. She had experienced this countless times before, the automatic assumption that her youth and gender meant she couldn't possibly contribute anything of value to serious military discussions. "I understand your skepticism, sir," Sarah replied calmly. "I've spent the last 3 years working with intelligence assets in the region. I speak 4 languages relevant to our current operations and have been analyzing communication patterns and strategic movements that might be relevant to today's discussion." General Morrison waved his hand dismissively. "Languages and analysis are fine for support roles, Lieutenant. But this is a strategic planning session for senior leadership. We're not here to discuss language skills or classroom theories. We're talking about real military action that could affect thousands of lives." The comment stung because it revealed everything wrong with how the military establishment viewed younger officers, especially women. Sarah had risked her life gathering intelligence in hostile territories, had decoded communications that prevented attacks, and had identified strategic vulnerabilities that senior analysts had missed. But in rooms like this, none of that mattered if you didn't have gray hair and enough medals to weigh down your uniform. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, one of the few women in the room, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sarah caught her eye briefly, hoping for some support, but Williams looked away. Sarah understood. Williams had probably fought similar battles throughout her career and couldn't risk undermining her own position by defending a junior officer. As the meeting progressed, Sarah listened to the discussion about troop movements, supply lines, and strategic objectives. The senior officers were debating a complex operation that involved multiple allied nations and required precise timing and coordination. She noticed several assumptions they were making about enemy capabilities and regional dynamics that didn't align with her recent intelligence findings. When there was a brief pause in the conversation, Sarah cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, sir, but I have some recent intelligence that might affect the timeline we're discussing." General Morrison didn't even look up from his documents. "Lieutenant, I thought we established that this is a senior leadership discussion. If you have support materials, you can submit them through proper channels after the meeting. But, sir, this information is time-sensitive and could impact the safety of our forces." Colonel Barnes turned in his chair to face her directly, his expression showing barely contained irritation. "Lieutenant Shun, let me explain something to you. Strategic military planning isn't about fresh-out-of-school theories or whatever analysis you think you've done. It's about experience, judgment, and understanding consequences. Those are things you develop after decades of service, not after reading intelligence reports for a few years. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being dismissed, of having her contributions devalued before they could even be heard. She had prepared extensively for this meeting, had reviewed every piece of relevant intelligence, and had identified potential problems that could derail the entire operation. But none of that mattered if the senior leadership wouldn't even listen. "Understand your perspective, sir," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not claiming to have the experience of everyone in this room, but intelligence doesn't care about rank or experience. When our assets report unusual activity or when communication patterns change, those facts don't become less important because they're reported by a lieutenant instead of a general." Her words hung in the air for a moment before General Morrison finally looked up at her. His expression was cold and final. "Lieutenant Shun, your enthusiasm is noted, but enthusiasm isn't what we need here. What we need is seasoned judgment and proven leadership. I suggest you use this opportunity to observe and learn rather than trying to contribute to discussions that are frankly above your level." The dismissal was complete and public. Sarah felt every eye in the room on her as she nodded stiffly and returned to silence. She spent the rest of the meeting taking notes, documenting the assumptions and decisions that she believed were flawed, knowing that no one would read her reports or take her concerns seriously. As the meeting concluded and officers began filing out, Sarah remained seated, reviewing her notes and thinking about the intelligence that had gone unheard. She had identified patterns in enemy communications that suggested the planned operation was walking into a trap. She had documented supply chain vulnerabilities that could leave Allied forces stranded. She had mapped regional political dynamics that could turn potential allies into enemies overnight. But in the eyes of the senior leadership, she was just an inexperienced lieutenant who didn't understand how real military operations worked. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very experience they claimed she lacked was exactly what she had been gaining in the field while they sat in Pentagon conference rooms, making decisions based on outdated information. Lieutenant Colonel Williams approached her as the room emptied. "Sarah, can I give you some advice?" Sarah looked up, hoping for some guidance or support. Williams glanced around to make sure they were alone before speaking quietly. "I know you think you have important information, but pushing back in meetings like this will only hurt your career. These men have been making these decisions for decades. Right or wrong, they don't want to hear challenges from junior officers, especially young women. My advice is to document everything you think is important and submit it through proper channels. Let someone with more rank present your findings." Sarah appreciated the advice, even though it frustrated her. What if there isn't time for proper channels? What if people are going to die because we're making decisions based on incomplete information? Williams sighed, her expression showing the weariness of someone who had fought similar battles for years. "Then you do your job, document everything, and hope that somehow the right information makes it to the right people at the right time. It's not fair, but it's reality." As Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave the briefing room, she made a decision. She would submit her intelligence through every proper channel available, but she wouldn't stop there. She had contacts in the intelligence community who might listen, who understood that good information could come from any source regardless of rank. The laughter and dismissive comments from the meeting echoed in her mind as she walked through the Pentagon corridors. She had endured similar treatment throughout her career, but this felt different. This wasn't about hurt feelings or career advancement. This was about military personnel walking into danger because senior leadership was too arrogant to listen to intelligence that challenged their assumptions. Sarah didn't know it yet, but the classified intelligence sitting in her secured files would prove to be the key to preventing a military disaster that could have cost hundreds of lives and destabilized an entire region. The same officers who had laughed at her rank and dismissed her expertise would soon find themselves in a very different position, when red-level classified orders arrived from the highest levels of government. The war room that had echoed with condescending laughter would soon fall silent, as the true value of Lieutenant Sarah Chen's intelligence became impossible to ignore. But that revelation was still days away, and for now, Sarah was just another underestimated junior officer carrying information that could change everything. Sarah spent the next 48 hours submitting her intelligence reports through every official channel she could access. She sent detailed analyses to the Defense Intelligence Agency, filed reports with Regional Command, and even requested meetings with senior analysts who might be willing to review her findings. Each submission was acknowledged with the same bureaucratic politeness that essentially meant her reports would disappear into the vast Pentagon filing system. Meanwhile, the operation discussed in the briefing room was moving forward on schedule. Sarah watched the preparations with growing anxiety, knowing that intelligence assets were reporting increased enemy activity in the exact areas where Allied forces would be most vulnerable. She had documented communication intercepts that suggested enemy forces knew about the planned operation and were positioning themselves accordingly. The breakthrough came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, when Sarah was working the night shift in the Intelligence Analysis Center. The secure communication terminal lit up with an urgent message from Asset Raven, one of her most reliable sources operating deep in enemy territory. The message was brief but alarming. Package discovered. They know. Timing, routes, everything. Trap being prepared. Recommend immediate abort. Sarah's heart raced as she read the message. This wasn't just confirmation of her suspicions. This was proof that the enemy had detailed knowledge of the planned operation. Someone had leaked information, or enemy intelligence had successfully penetrated Allied communications. Either way, dozens of Allied personnel were about to walk into a carefully planned ambush. She immediately tried to contact Colonel Richards, the senior intelligence officer who should have been her direct superior on night duty. His phone went straight to voicemail. She tried Lieutenant Colonel Williams, knowing she was risking her career by bypassing the chain of command, but got no answer. The operation was scheduled to begin in less than 18 hours, and every minute of delay could cost lives. Sarah made a decision that would either save careers or end her own. She accessed the emergency communication protocols reserved for imminent threats to Allied forces and sent a flash message directly to the Pentagon Operations Center. The message was flagged as critical and automatically routed to senior command staff, regardless of the sender's rank. Within 30 minutes, her secure phone rang. The voice on the other end was cold and furious. Lieutenant Shun, this is General Morrison. Did you just send an unauthorized flash message claiming operational security has been compromised? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing this conversation would determine everything that followed. Yes, sir. I have intelligence indicating that enemy forces have detailed knowledge of our planned operation. I believe Allied personnel are walking into an ambush, and you decided to bypass your entire chain of command to send a panic message directly to senior leadership? Do you have any idea what kind of disruption you've caused? Sir, I tried to reach my immediate superiors but couldn't make contact. The operation is scheduled to begin in 17 hours, and I believe we have confirmation that operational security has been compromised. There was a long pause before Morrison's voice returned, even colder than before. Lieutenant Shun, report to the Pentagon immediately. We're going to have a conversation about proper procedures and the consequences of unauthorized communications. Sarah arrived at the Pentagon 90 minutes later to find the same briefing room where she had been dismissed days earlier. This time, the atmosphere was different. General Morrison was pacing behind the head of the table, while Colonel Barnes and several other senior officers sat in tense silence. Sarah noticed that Lieutenant Colonel Williams was also present, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Sit down, Lieutenant, Morrison commanded without looking at her. We're here because you've made some very serious claims and caused a significant disruption to ongoing operations. You're going to explain exactly what intelligence you think you have and why you felt justified in bypassing every level of command to present it. Sarah opened her secured file folder and began laying out her analysis methodically. She presented the communication intercepts that showed unusual enemy activity patterns, the intelligence reports from multiple assets indicating increased surveillance of Allied positions, and, finally, the urgent message from Asset Raven confirming enemy knowledge of the operation. As she spoke, she noticed the expressions around the table beginning to change. Colonel Barnes, who had mocked her expertise days earlier, was leaning forward and studying the documents intently. Williams was taking notes, her earlier discomfort replaced by focused attention. "This asset you call Raven," Morrison interrupted. "How long have you been running this source?" 2 years and for months, sir. Raven has provided actionable intelligence that prevented 3 previous attacks and identified 2 weapon supply networks that were successfully disrupted. Morrison exchanged glances with Colonel Barnes before continuing. "And you're certain this communication is authentic?" "Yes, sir. The message includes authentication codes and references to previous communications that only Raven would know. Additionally, the intelligence aligns with patterns we've been observing through other sources." For the first time since Sarah had known him, General Morrison looked uncertain. He studied the documents spread across the table, his earlier anger replaced by the kind of focused intensity that came with recognizing a genuine crisis. "Colonel Barnes, get the communications team in here immediately. I want every message and intercept Lieutenant Chun has reference verified and cross-checked with other intelligence sources." Over the next 3 hours, the briefing room transformed into an emergency analysis center. Intelligence specialists arrived with their equipment, communication experts verified the authenticity of intercepts, and analysts confirmed the patterns Sarah had identified. With each verification, the atmosphere in the room grew more tense. The breakthrough came when Senior Analyst Thompson, who had been quietly reviewing communication patterns, looked up from his computer with a grave expression. "General, we have a problem. Lieutenant Chin's analysis is not only accurate, it's incomplete. We're seeing additional indicators that suggest this compromise is broader than we initially thought." Thompson connected his laptop to the main display and showed a comprehensive map of communication intercepts from the past week. Enemy forces weren't just aware of the planned operation. They had been systematically gathering intelligence on Allied positions, supply routes, and personnel movements across the entire region. "Sir," Thompson continued, "based on this analysis, proceeding with the operation as planned would result in catastrophic losses. The enemy isn't just prepared for our forces. They're prepared to eliminate them entirely." The room fell completely silent. Sarah watched as the same officers who had dismissed her expertise days earlier grappled with the realization that a junior lieutenant had identified a threat that could have resulted in one of the worst military disasters in recent history. General Morrison stood slowly and walked to the display showing the enemy positions and intelligence patterns. When he turned back to the room, his expression was grim but decisive. "Colonel Barnes, initiate emergency communication protocols. All forces involved in the operation are to halt and maintain current positions pending new orders. No movement, no communication, nothing that could compromise their locations further. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, I want a complete review of our communication security protocols. If enemy forces have this level of detail about our operations, we have a serious breach that needs to be identified and contained immediately." Morrison then turned to Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Chun, your analysis has potentially prevented a military catastrophe. However, your methods of presenting this intelligence violated every protocol we have for a reason. We'll address that separately." As orders were issued and the emergency response took shape, Sarah realized that her career had reached a turning point. She had been proven right about the intelligence, but she had also defied direct orders and bypassed the entire chain of command to present her findings. The same actions that might have saved dozens of lives could also end her military career. What she didn't know was that her intelligence reports and emergency communications had already been flagged by automated systems and were being reviewed at the highest levels of the Defense Department. Intelligence agencies that operated far above the Pentagon bureaucracy were taking notice of the junior officer who had identified a major security breach that senior leadership had missed. In secure facilities across Washington, analysts were reviewing not just Sarah's current intelligence, but her entire record of service and previous intelligence reports. What they were discovering would soon result in communications that would transform the dismissive laughter in Pentagon briefing rooms into respectful silence. The red-level classified orders that would soon arrive would change everything. But for now, Sarah was still just a lieutenant who had risked her career to prevent a disaster that most people would never even know had been threatened while the Pentagon scrambled to address the immediate crisis. A different kind of investigation was unfolding in the classified levels of the intelligence community. Sarah's emergency communication had triggered automatic security protocols that sent her intelligence analysis directly to the National Security Agency and Defense Intelligence Agency for independent verification. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, a senior intelligence analyst with 30 years of experience, was reviewing Sarah's complete intelligence file in a secured facility 20 miles outside Washington. Unlike the Pentagon generals who had focused on Sarah's rank and age, Hayes was interested only in the accuracy and quality of her intelligence work. What she found was remarkable. Sarah's intelligence reports over the past 3 years showed an unusual pattern of accuracy and insight that had gone largely unnoticed by mid-level Pentagon bureaucracy. She had identified terrorist financing networks that other analysts had missed, predicted political instability in regions that senior experts considered stable, and maintained intelligence assets that provided consistently reliable information. More importantly, Hayes discovered that Sarah's current analysis about the compromised operation was just the tip of a much larger intelligence breakthrough. The pattern Sarah had identified suggested a sophisticated enemy intelligence network that had been operating undetected for months, possibly years. Hayes reached for her secure phone and dialed a number that connected directly to the Director of National Intelligence. "Sir, we have a situation that requires immediate attention. I'm sending you a classified intelligence report that suggests we have a major security breach affecting multiple ongoing operations." 48 hours later, Sarah was summoned to a meeting location she had never seen before. The address led her to an unmarked government building where she was escorted through multiple security checkpoints by personnel who didn't wear standard military uniforms. She found herself in a conference room with people she didn't recognize, facing questions unlike any she had encountered in her military career. "Lieutenant Shun," said a woman who introduced herself only as Director Hayes, "we've reviewed your intelligence analysis, and we have some questions about your methods and sources." Unlike the Pentagon briefings where she had been dismissed and mocked, this questioning was intense but respectful. The people asking questions understood intelligence work and were interested in the substance of her findings rather than her rank or appearance. "Your asset, Raven," Hayes continued, "has provided intelligence that allowed us to identify a network of compromised communications that extends far beyond the operation you helped prevent. Can you tell us more about how you developed and maintained this source?" Sarah explained her methodical approach to asset development, her language skills that allowed her to communicate directly without translators, and her patience in building trust over months of careful contact. She described how she had identified patterns in communication that suggested coordinated intelligence gathering by enemy forces. "The officers at the Pentagon seemed to think my methods were unconventional," Sarah said carefully, unsure how much criticism of senior leadership she should express. A man who had been silent throughout most of the questioning looked up from his notes. "Lieutenant, your methods weren't unconventional. They were professional intelligence work that seems to have been misunderstood by people who should have known better." Over the course of 6 hours, Sarah found herself explaining not just her recent intelligence discovery, but her entire approach to intelligence analysis. She described how she had identified patterns that others missed, how she had developed sources that provided unique access to enemy planning, and how she had been trying for months to report security vulnerabilities that were being ignored by mid-level Pentagon leadership. What emerged from a questioning was a picture of systematic failures in intelligence processing and evaluation. Sarah's reports had been consistently accurate, but they were being filtered through layers of bureaucracy that prioritized rank and experience over accuracy and insight. Lieutenant Sean Hayes said as the session concluded, "Your intelligence work has been exceptional, and your recent analysis may have prevented a significant military disaster. However, we've also discovered that the security breach you identified is part of a much larger problem." Sarah was sworn to additional levels of secrecy and told that she would be receiving new orders within 48 hours. She was also informed that her intelligence reports and methods would be subject to review by agencies she couldn't discuss with anyone, including her current chain of command. When she returned to her regular duties at the Pentagon, Sarah found the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The operation she had helped prevent had been officially canceled due to changing intelligence assessments, but word had spread through the intelligence community about the junior officer who had identified a major security threat. Colonel Barnes, who had questioned her expertise just days earlier, approached her with an expression that mixed respect with embarrassment. "Lieutenant Shun, I owe you an apology. Your intelligence analysis was not only accurate, it was sophisticated work that saved lives and prevented a military catastrophe. I spoke inappropriately in the briefing room, and I want you to know that I was wrong." Similar conversations took place throughout the week as senior officers who had dismissed her began to understand the significance of what she had discovered. But Sarah sensed that these local acknowledgments were nothing compared to whatever was happening in the classified levels above Pentagon leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Williams found her in the Intelligence Analysis Center late one evening. "Sarah, there are rumors that your intelligence work has attracted attention at very high levels. People are saying that agencies above our clearance level are reviewing your methods and findings. Have you heard anything official?" Sarah shook her head, but she had noticed changes in her security access levels and had received instructions to report to facilities she couldn't discuss. Her intelligence reports were now being processed through channels that bypassed normal Pentagon bureaucracy entirely. What neither Sarah nor Williams knew was that her intelligence analysis had exposed a security breach that affected multiple allied nations and ongoing operations across several continents. Enemy intelligence services had been systematically penetrating allied communications and planning operations that would have eliminated key intelligence assets and military personnel. The investigation that began with Sarah's emergency communication had revealed a level of security compromise that required response from the highest levels of the intelligence community. Agencies that operated in the classified shadows were mobilizing resources and personnel for operations that would remain secret for years. In secure facilities across Washington, analysts and operations specialists were developing response plans that would neutralize the enemy intelligence network and secure compromised communication systems. The junior lieutenant, who had been laughed at in Pentagon briefing rooms, had triggered intelligence operations that spanned multiple continents and involved some of the most sophisticated resources in the American intelligence community. The red-level classified orders that would soon arrive at the Pentagon would be the visible result of an invisible war that Sarah had helped expose. The same officers who had questioned her qualifications would soon find themselves following orders that originated from her intelligence discoveries, though they would never know the connection. As Sarah continued her regular duties, she began to notice subtle changes in how she was treated. Senior officers who had ignored her now sought her opinions on intelligence matters. Her reports were being processed with unusual speed and priority, and she occasionally caught glimpses of personnel she didn't recognize reviewing her work in the secure intelligence facilities. The investigation that began with her emergency communication was expanding far beyond anything she had imagined. But the full scope of what she had discovered would only become clear when classified orders arrived that would silence the war room, where she had been dismissed and mocked just weeks earlier. The call came at 5:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. General Morrison was awakened by his aide with news that would fundamentally change his understanding of military hierarchy and intelligence operations. "Sir, we have priority red communications waiting for you at the Pentagon. You're requested to arrive immediately with your senior staff for an emergency briefing." Red-level communications were reserved for the highest priority national security matters, often involving direct orders from the president or critical intelligence that affected ongoing operations worldwide. Morrison had received perhaps 3 such communications in his 30-year career, and never before had he been summoned with such urgency. When Morrison arrived at the Pentagon, he found that Colonel Barnes, Lieutenant Colonel Williams, and several other officers from his command had also been summoned. They were directed to the same briefing room where they had dismissed Lieutenant Sarah Chen's concerns just 2 weeks earlier. But this time a room had been transformed into a secure communication center with equipment they didn't recognize. 2 individuals in civilian clothes were waiting for them, along with a military communications specialist who was setting up encrypted projection systems. Morrison noticed that neither of the civilians wore identification badges or introduced themselves with titles or agency affiliations. "General Morrison," said the older of the 2 civilians, a woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, "I'm Director Hayes from the Defense Intelligence Agency. We're here regarding Lieutenant Chen's intelligence analysis and the security breach she identified." Morrison felt a sinking sensation as he realized this briefing was directly related to the junior officer he had dismissed and berated. "Ma'am, we've already addressed Lieutenant Chen's unauthorized communications and taken appropriate action regarding the compromised operation." Hayes exchanged a glance with her colleague before responding. "General, Lieutenant Chen's intelligence analysis exposed a security breach that extends far beyond the operation you canceled. We're here to brief you on the scope of that breach and provide you with classified orders regarding how it will be addressed." The lights dimmed as the projection system activated, displaying a classification banner that read "Top Secret /SCI/Red Compartmentalized," a security level that Morrison had rarely encountered in his entire career. What followed was a briefing unlike anything Morrison had experienced. Hayes presented a comprehensive analysis showing that the enemy intelligence network Sarah had identified had been operating for over 2 years, successfully penetrating Allied communications, mapping military installations, identifying intelligence assets, and planning coordinated strikes that would have crippled Western intelligence operations across 3 continents. The intelligence provided by Lieutenant Chen's assets, Hayes continued, allowed us to identify 17 compromised communication networks, 43 intelligence personnel whose lives were in immediate danger, and ongoing operations in 7 countries that were walking into carefully planned traps. Colonel Barnes leaned forward in his chair, his expression showing the dawning realization of what they were hearing. "Ma'am, are you saying that Lieutenant Chen identified a security breach that affected global operations?" "I'm saying that Lieutenant Chen's intelligence work and analysis prevented what could have been the most successful enemy intelligence operation against Western forces since World War II. Her asset network provided the keys to unraveling a sophisticated network that other agencies had been unable to detect." The second civilian, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "General Morrison, Lieutenant Chen's intelligence work has attracted the attention of agencies and officials at the highest levels of government. We're here to inform you that she will be receiving new orders that supersede normal chain of command protocols." Hayes activated another projection showing organizational charts and communication flows that Morrison didn't recognize. Effective immediately, Lieutenant Chen is being transferred to a joint intelligence task force that operates under direct authority from the National Security Council. Her previous intelligence work is being reviewed for broader applications, and her methods are being studied for implementation across multiple agencies. Morrison felt his world shifting as he realized that the junior officer he had dismissed as inexperienced and presumptuous had been recognized at levels of government he rarely interacted with. "Ma'am, with respect, Lieutenant Chen bypassed her entire chain of command when she sent that emergency communication. While her intelligence may have been accurate, her methods were completely inappropriate. The room fell silent before Hayes responded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who operated at levels far above Pentagon bureaucracy. General, Lieutenant Chen's methods saved lives and exposed a security threat that senior intelligence professionals had missed for 2 years. Her decision to send an emergency communication when she couldn't reach her superiors prevented a military disaster. From our perspective, her methods were not only appropriate, they were exemplary intelligence work under pressure. Hayes then presented the most shocking revelation of the briefing. General, the security breach Lieutenant Chen identified included penetration of Pentagon communication systems. Enemy intelligence services had been monitoring your planning meetings, including the meeting where Lieutenant Chen's intelligence was dismissed. They knew about her findings and were planning to eliminate her assets before their network could be fully exposed. Colonel Barnes looked physically ill as he realized the implications. They were listening to our classified briefings for approximately 18 months, yes. Lieutenant Chen's assets reported unusual enemy knowledge of Allied planning, but her reports were processed through the same compromised systems that allowed enemy forces to monitor how we responded to intelligence. The final element of the briefing was the most humbling for Morrison and his staff. Hayes presented a detailed analysis of how the Pentagon's hierarchical approach to intelligence evaluation had created vulnerabilities that enemy services had successfully exploited. Lieutenant Chen's intelligence was consistently accurate and professionally presented, Hayes explained, but it was being filtered through layers of bureaucracy that prioritized rank and experience over accuracy and insight. This created a situation where critical intelligence was ignored or delayed, giving enemy forces opportunities to exploit our vulnerabilities. Hayes then handed Morrison a sealed envelope bearing classification markings he had never seen before. General, these are your new orders regarding Lieutenant Chen and the ongoing operation to neutralize the security threat she identified. You'll note that these orders come from authority levels that supersede normal Pentagon command structure. Morrison opened the envelope with hands that weren't entirely steady. The orders were brief, but comprehensive, directing him to provide Lieutenant Chen with whatever resources and support she required for ongoing intelligence operations, to implement security protocols she recommended, and to ensure that her future intelligence reports received immediate attention regardless of normal bureaucratic procedures. The orders also directed that all personnel involved in dismissing or impeding Lieutenant Chen's intelligence work would participate in mandatory training on intelligence evaluation and the dangers of allowing rank-based prejudices to interfere with critical analysis. As the briefing concluded, Hayes addressed the group with words that would echo in their minds for years to come. Gentlemen, Lieutenant Chen represents the kind of intelligence professional that modern military operations require. She combines language skills, cultural understanding, analytical expertise, and field experience in ways that transcend traditional rank structures. The enemy intelligence network she exposed was successful precisely because they understood that good intelligence can come from any source, regardless of rank or experience level. Your dismissal of her intelligence nearly resulted in a catastrophe that would have cost lives and compromised operations worldwide. We're here to ensure that such failures of leadership don't happen again. As Morrison and his staff filed out of the briefing room, they carried with them the humbling realization that their prejudices and assumptions about rank and experience had nearly contributed to a military disaster. The junior officer they had mocked and dismissed had been operating at levels of intelligence work that they barely understood, and her expertise was now being recognized at the highest levels of government. The war room where they had laughed at her rank would never echo with such dismissive laughter again. The red-level orders in Morrison's hands ensured that Lieutenant Sarah Chen would never again be dismissed because of her age or rank, and her intelligence work would receive the respect and attention it had always deserved 6 months later. The same Pentagon briefing room that had once echoed with dismissive laughter was hosting a very different kind of meeting. General Morrison stood at attention as he prepared to read a citation that would fundamentally change how the military establishment viewed young intelligence professionals. Sarah Chun, now Captain Chun, following an accelerated promotion that bypassed normal timelines, stood at the head of the table where she had once been relegated to the far corner. The silver bars on her uniform reflected not just a promotion in rank, but recognition of intelligence work that had prevented international catastrophes and transformed how multiple agencies approached threat assessment. The citation Morrison read detailed achievements that would remain classified for decades, but the assembled officers understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Sarah had been awarded the Defense Intelligence Agency's highest honor for intelligence work, the National Security Agency's Distinguished Service Medal, and citations from Allied intelligence services in 4 countries. More significantly, she had been appointed to lead a new joint intelligence task force that reported directly to the National Security Council, a position that placed her outside normal military hierarchy and gave her authority that transcended traditional rank structures. Captain Chun, Morrison concluded, your intelligence work over the past year has prevented military casualties, exposed security vulnerabilities, and provided strategic advantages that continue to benefit Allied operations worldwide. Your dedication to excellence and your courage in presenting critical intelligence under difficult circumstances exemplify the highest traditions of military service. The assembled officers applauded, but Sarah could see in their faces the complex emotions of people who were simultaneously proud of her achievements and humbled by their previous misjudgments. Colonel Barnes, who had questioned her expertise so dismissively months earlier, was among the most enthusiastic in his applause, his expression showing genuine respect and perhaps some lingering embarrassment. After the ceremony, Morrison approached Sarah privately. Captain Chun, I owe you a personal apology that goes beyond what I expressed in the briefing room months ago. My dismissal of your intelligence was not just wrong. It was dangerous and unprofessional. I let prejudices about rank and experience cloud my judgment about critical intelligence, and that failure nearly cost lives. Sarah appreciated the apology, but her response reflected the maturity and professionalism that had characterized her work throughout the crisis. General, the important thing is that we learned from the experience and improved our procedures. The intelligence community works best when good information can flow freely regardless of where it originates. What Morrison didn't fully understand was the extent to which Sarah's intelligence work had transformed operations far beyond the Pentagon. The asset network she had developed was now being used by multiple agencies to monitor threats across several continents. Her analytical methods were being studied and implemented by intelligence professionals who had decades more experience, but recognized the unique insights her approach provided. In secure facilities across Washington, Sarah's case had become a study in how traditional hierarchical structures could impede critical intelligence work. Training programs now use her experience as an example of why intelligence evaluation must be based on accuracy and relevance rather than rank and seniority. The enemy intelligence network she had exposed had been systematically dismantled over the months following her initial discovery. Operations that spanned multiple countries had successfully neutralized communication vulnerabilities, eliminated compromised assets, and restored security to operations that had been unknowingly vulnerable for years. Perhaps more importantly, Allied intelligence services had implemented new protocols for intelligence evaluation that ensured critical information could reach decision-makers regardless of its source. Sarah's experience had highlighted vulnerabilities in intelligence processing that extended far beyond the Pentagon, and the solutions developed in response had strengthened intelligence operations worldwide. Lieutenant Colonel Williams, who had advised Sarah to work through proper channels despite the urgency of her intelligence, had also learned valuable lessons from the experience. She now served as Sarah's deputy in the new task force, and their working relationship had evolved into a partnership that combined Williams' experience with Sarah's innovative approaches to intelligence analysis. Sarah, Williams said as they reviewed intelligence reports in their new facility, I've been thinking about the advice I gave you during the crisis. I told you to work through proper channels and let someone with more rank present your findings. I was wrong about that, wasn't I? Sarah looked up from her analysis screens, considering her response carefully. You were giving me the advice that protected careers and maintained institutional stability. But sometimes institutional stability has to give way to institutional effectiveness. The challenge is knowing when the intelligence is important enough to risk the institutional pushback. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from Asset Raven, the source whose intelligence had triggered the entire sequence of events. Sarah had maintained contact with Raven throughout the crisis and its aftermath, and the intelligence provided continued to be consistently valuable. The latest communication reported unusual activity that suggested another potential security threat, but this time the response would be different. Instead of facing skepticism and dismissal, Sarah's intelligence would be evaluated by professionals who understood its value and acted on it without prejudice about its source. As Sarah prepared her analysis and recommendations, she reflected on how dramatically her professional world had changed. The same intelligence skills that had been dismissed and mocked were now recognized at the highest levels of government. The asset networks she had carefully developed were now considered among the most valuable intelligence resources in the American intelligence community. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the military establishment approached intelligence evaluation. The procedures implemented following Sarah's experience ensured that critical intelligence would be evaluated based on its accuracy and relevance rather than the rank or experience of the person presenting it. Young intelligence professionals throughout the military now had pathways to present critical findings without facing the institutional barriers that had nearly prevented Sarah's intelligence from reaching decision-makers. Training programs emphasized the importance of recognizing good intelligence regardless of its source, and evaluation protocols prioritized substance over seniority. The briefing room where Sarah had once been dismissed now hosted regular meetings where intelligence professionals of all ranks presented their findings to senior leadership. The culture had shifted from one that valued hierarchy over accuracy to one that recognized intelligence excellence wherever it occurred. 6 months after the crisis, General Morrison found himself in the unusual position of seeking intelligence briefings from someone he had once dismissed as inexperienced and presumptuous. Sarah's task force had become one of the most effective intelligence units in the American military, and her analytical methods were being adopted by agencies across the intelligence community. The transformation was complete when Morrison received orders to attend a briefing that Sarah would be presenting to senior leadership from multiple agencies. As he prepared to receive intelligence analysis from the officer he had once relegated to silent observation, he reflected on the lessons learned from nearly missing one of the most important intelligence discoveries in recent military history. The war room that had once echoed with dismissive laughter about her rank now fell silent with respectful attention when Captain Sarah Chun presented her intelligence assessments. The red-level orders that had humbled the Pentagon leadership had achieved their intended effect, ensuring that critical intelligence would never again be dismissed because of prejudices about rank, age, or experience. Sarah's story became legendary within the intelligence community, not just as an example of excellent analytical work, but as proof that institutional barriers to effective intelligence evaluation could be overcome when leadership was willing to prioritize accuracy over hierarchy. The junior officer who had been laughed at for her rank had transformed how the military establishment approached intelligence work, ensuring that future intelligence professionals would be evaluated based on the quality of their work rather than the insignia on their uniforms.